Today we are touching on a very controversial topic with a very provocative title, Imagined Communities, the Objective Modernity of Nations versus their Subjective Antiquity in the Eyes of Nationalists. And today we have two speakers with us who will touch in depth on this issue. It's Mirkamran and Huseynli, our first speaker, a PhD researcher at the Department of Political Science at Vytautas Magnus University, and a visiting PhD fellow at Center for East European Studies at the University of Zurich. And our second speaker is Philip Gamaghelyan, assistant professor at the Kroc School of Peace Studies at the University of San Diego, and editor of the Caucasus edition. I will be today moderating this session. I'm Lala Darchinova, and I am the editor of the Caucasus edition. Our webinar, as usual, is 1 hour. First 30-40 minutes we'll be discussing together with the speakers, and the second part of the webinar we are reserving for the discussion with the audience. But please don't keep your questions until the last minute. You can always type the questions in the Q&A section, and closer to the end we'll be able to answer them. And the recording, the webinar will be recorded and uploaded to our social media platforms, which you can access later during the week and of course share and spread. All right, let's not lose more time and start. So my first question will be to Mirkamran. So Mirkamran, how would you define a nation and its main ideology? Are they even separate things? This nation, ethno-nationalism, and how do you think they manifest itself in Armenia-Azerbaijani relations?
Thank you, Lala. Thank you for the question. Hello, everyone. There has been wide variety of definitions of nation and nationalism given by seminal authors like Benedict Anderson, Ernest Gellner, Eric Hobsbawm, Anthony Smith, Laia Grenfell, Roger Brubaker, and list could go on. But I will start with the most prominent classic, such as Ernest Gellner. Gellner's definition is nationalism is a political principle where political and national unit are congruent. This means Gellner's definition presupposes national unit to be ethnically bounded and homogeneous unit. If this congruity between nationalism, national unit, and political unit, if this congruity does not match, then national principle is violated. For instance, if political boundary of a given state fails to include all members of the nation, or if the political boundary includes all the members of the nation, but also non-nationals, or nation state is getting ruled by a non-national, all of these instances are violation of nationalist principle according to Ernest Gellner definition. So from this definition, we can see that Gellner defines nationalism with its principles. Another definition is given by Benedict Anderson. And for Anderson, nation is an imagined political community. It is an imagined community because members will never know most of their co-nationals, and members will never meet their co-nationals in their lives. Yet everyone within that nation imagine rest of the members as part of their community. So this definition clearly stresses the act of imagining as the gist of national consciousness. For instance, if I am a French national, I would never know rest of the 60 million French people in my life because it's impossible. Or if Phil is American national, we would never know rest of the 300 million Americans. So, but we like imagine ourselves as French or American or this or that nation, and that sense of imagination makes us part of that nation because everyone from that nation imagine themselves part of that nation. So, and Anderson distinguishes national community from other imagined communities because there have been in history different forms of imagined communities, such as religious and dynastic community of medieval period, or class-based community of worker organizations, such as proletariat. So according to Anderson, what makes national imagination different from others is print capitalism. It was the introduction of print capitalism to the societal realm in the 16th century, which led to the increase of publishing in vernacular languages, and that is how international consciousness began replacing the religious sectarian consciousness of medieval era, and that is how we are as part of the nations of the world. And when it comes to nationalism as an ideology, Lala asked that what like nation and nationalism, like the difference. Nationalism is the name of the ideology of all of these nationhoods. And for the first time, nationalist ideology was invoked during the First French Republic, according to Elie Keduri and many of the classics. It was invoked with the universal male suffrage. It was invoked with the countrywide military conscription. It was invoked with the mainstream media, with the public education, with the popular speeches by the politicians, and so many other ways. And that is how nationalist ideology began dominating the minds of the masses. And to shortly contextualize in the Armenian-Azerbaijani cases, of course, it's a long discussion, but to be brief, Armenian-Azerbaijani nationalism also fits to that definition that I just gave. For instance, Armenian-Azerbaijani nationalism blossomed during 19th century, where Armenian version started slightly a bit earlier than Azerbaijani version, but it progressed and blossomed during 19th and early 20th centuries with the help of nationally conscious intellectuals and national entrepreneurs in both of the examples, who advocated the nationalism of their amongst their populace through different ways, such as print journals in the local vernacular languages, by opening national schools, national organizations, and that is how also populace started getting mobilizing around these intellectuals. And Brubaker has said that there is no solution to ethno-national conflict because nationalism is inherently ambitious and conflictual phenomenon. And in line with Brubaker, that is how Armenians on the one side, Turco-Muslims on the other side. Turco-Muslim is the name of the Azerbaijani community during 19th century. So these two communities clashed with each other in an unprecedented scale for the first time in 1905, and later on in 1918, March and September, and finally in the past 30 years. So in every ethnic violence, the national imaginaries of Armenians, Azerbaijanis became more reified or more thingified, if we have to use Bauman's term. And it was these periods of clash and violence that turned putative ethno-national identities into something hard, something more salient and emotionally more powerful than ever, which is called process of reification or reification of nationalism. So these are how I would contextualize these two cases. I will stop it here.
Okay, thanks a lot. This is already, I think, a very rich introduction. And now I want to turn to Philip. Philip, what Mirkamran is saying, referring to Brubaker, is like we are doomed because we are in an ethno-nationalist conflict. So maybe you continue on this, but I also want to a bit direct the question in the further to stir our conversation further. How do you think this modern concepts, as Mirkamran is referring, started to dominate our imagination, and at the same time assuming that they are very ancient and coming from antiquity, while at the same time being a very products of the modernity. So if you can start also replying by Mirkamran, but also moving into this direction, I'll be very grateful.
Thank you, Lala, and thank you, Mirkamran, for starting. When we took this topic on, it was clear that it's a very big one to cover in 1 hour, and so thank you for really being able to frame it in especially the key theoretical thinker's way. About the pessimism and optimism on this, in the short term, on medium term, I'm actually with Mirkamran. It's yes, the doom is very real. Nationalism is so prevalent right now that once you are in that framework, once you are working within that ideology, once it is central to your state building concept, then essentially the war, and especially if it's already supported by the war, then it's very hard to come out of that. So I'll get to it in a second. But on a bit less pessimistic and on a longer term, nationalism is extremely heterogeneous. So it's extremely hard to explain what it is. So it seems that when you're in a particular time of space, say Armenia or Azerbaijan, it's very obvious what it is. But if you take a step out, it's an extremely heterogeneous concept. So it's not necessarily the type of an ethno-national fully community that we imagine it in that particular space. And that means it can potentially transform a lot. And what do I mean by this heterogeneity? Right. So, for example, the early nation states, we tend to think that these are actually the ones like Armenia or Europe. That's actually not. The earlier nation states actually are in Americas. Because prior to that, we did not have nation states. Prior to that, we had different forms of political organization. From my position, at least, the first nation state is the United States of America. And so then American Revolution, French Revolution, which defined essentially political organization through a national community as opposed to loyalty to sovereign, to the god, right? So actually, it was specifically loyalty of people to a national community. And then if you look into the US as an example of a nation, it's very different from, right, say Armenia or Azerbaijan as a nation. How was it formed? It's first of all, you have settlers, European settlers who come in, right, and dominate the continent. So they are the dominant class that then rebels against their sovereign and creates a nation state. So the dominant class is the not indigenous group. It's actually a settler, descendants of settlers, right? So that's one category of people you have in an American nation. Second category you have is indigenous populations who've been massacred essentially and either fully, practically genocided or subjected to genocide, as is the case in the United States, or a bit less maybe, but still to a great extent as in South America. But you have this very small number of indigenous. Then you have a very big number of enslaved folks and their descendants who were moved forcefully through other continents, primarily from Africa, their descendants, and a very big emigration. So you have at least 4 categories of people: settlers, for descendants of enslaved people, indigenous, and immigrants from all over the world. And if you think it's a small part of the world, it's not. It's the entire. It's 3 continents. It's the entire South and North Americas. It's Australia, right? So 3 continents are fully based on this extremely heterogeneous composition of populations, and that somehow holds together as a nation at the same time. So that's one category. Second category are the European states, right, which have some claim. Their legitimacy is somewhat based on the claim on ingenuity or being indigenous. I mean, sorry, wrong word there. So being indigenous, right? So that's the concept we are most familiar with in Caucasus, I would say, where some kind of indigenous groups turn themselves eventually into nation. But there is a caveat there. There is a bit of asterisk, as I'll get to in a second. And then there is a third category, which are the other big part of the states, which are post-colonial states, which have been decolonized after these first 2 categories were established. Essentially, the American settler states, then European nation states, then in a kind of decolonizing period, especially during World War II, that preceding and later, and the latest comers, of course, the Soviet states, post-Soviet states, were essentially replicating the models that were previously seen along the administrative boundaries of the empires, right? So there was nothing necessarily indigenous about Iraq or Kuwait border, right? So it was essentially wherever the British line, administrative line was. Similarly, Soviet borders are effectively, right? So Soviet Union, post-Soviet borders are Soviet Union administrative division borders. So they're kind of somewhat artificially based on the administrative boundaries of the empire, yet trying to replicate the legitimacy claims by the either European states, which are based on some kind of ethnic group coming to power, or American version of joining around some kind of values, in that case, freedom, right? So, and what else we know about the American Constitution. So these are, again, 3 very different ways of coming together as states, 3 very different claims of, whatever nation is. And yet somehow we are thinking of nationalism and nation as one, right? And they're extremely heterogeneous in terms of composition, in terms of what holds it together. So there where I see is constant change and constant change of what legitimacy that holds together the state is. In that sense, I do see a hope in the longer term, where the state will probably be redefined sooner or later. Because again, as Mirkamran mentioned, I fully agree, the nation as we have it is extremely new concept. It only came to be in the last 2 centuries. Prior to that, nation state. Prior to that, we had a very different form of political organization. So it's temporal. It's very contemporary. It's fully, I agree with Mirkamran's definition with Anderson that it came to be because it was possible thanks to Industrial Revolution and the invention of print press to somehow top down through print media initially, then TV, and also later mass education to create a homogeneous just homogenize, assimilate big groups of people. Like every morning you get up and give your allegiance to the flag, right? Every morning you sing, or every afternoon you sing some nationalist songs. You read the same exact story of your nation in history textbooks. So that was this major project of homogenizing very desperate, very disconnected from each other populations. Again, possible because of invention of print press and full state control at some point over the knowledge production. That is going away, right? So through social media, through a lot, you see you cannot anymore contain Azerbaijanis and Armenians in separate spaces informationally, right? So we are sharing information across. So that will inevitably have to change then the way a nation or political entity is held together or constructed. And we are already seeing the breakdown is going in opposite direction. The dominant groups are going to more like fascist style ideologies of say white nationalism, right? Or in particular, Georgians for Georgians, Armenia for Armenians, right? So kind of much smaller groups of people essentially trying to hold it together and then dominate the rest. So it's breaking apart in a violent way, unfortunately, all over, right? But it is breaking apart. So that's holding together that national community separate from other nations. In absence of top-down control, the states are able to exercise over information production. I think completely changes the game and how the ideology is sustained. Sorry, again, it's not an easy answer, not an easy question.
No, thank you. I think you are covering it pretty well. And what I'm hearing is that the nation itself then is not essential. That's what I'm hearing from both of you. It's not natural, and it's probably not in our bloods, as many in our countries, in our region, not only countries, believe in. And then I want to turn again to Mirkamran. Then okay, we also know the terms like civic and ethnic nationalism. Do you think they are fundamentally different concepts, or they are at least the same side, or the different sides of the same coin? What do you think about these concepts? Mirkamran, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. It's really a challenging one, and it has been a challenge for many of the nationalism researchers. So classics of nationalism conceptualized, as you mentioned, two sources, Western nationalism and Eastern nationalism, which means Western nationalism would coincide more or less with the civic form of national identity, exemplified by French and British examples, and Eastern nationalism would coincide with ethnic form of national identity, exemplified German and East European examples. And this conventional dichotomy, it derives from the seminal work of an author called Hans Kohn. With this conceptualization, Kohn attempted to capture certain conspicuous differences in the historical record of certain nations. However, one has to remind that civic and ethnic distinctions, it's in the state of art literature, it's actually regarded as outdated concepts. I will return to Brubaker again. This is a long discussion, but I'm going to directly go to the critique of the civic and ethnic forms so we can understand why they are problematic. Yeah, we can say that, like, civic form is the civic nationalism is the one based on citizenship, and ethnic form is based on blood or language or whatever. But Brubaker notes that this conceptualization provides a Manichaean view where civic version is depicted as something good and the ethnic version is depicted as something bad, because one is based on citizenship, the other is based on ethnicity. But this conceptualization is flawed and very Orientalist one. It is Orientalist, especially towards East European nationalisms, simply because this view depicts ethno-national conflict of 90s in the Balkans, Caucasus, East Europe at large as purely ethnic, thus inherently something bad. And that is how post-Cold War Eastern Europe was associated entirely with ethnic nationalism. And it is Brubaker who problematized these conceptualizations. Instead of civic and ethnic division, Brubaker uses the term ethnocultural nationalism, which is against used instead of ethnic nationalism. He uses ethnocultural nationalism, and instead of civic one, he uses acultural citizenship. And Brubaker says that in reality, despite these nation states might claim that they are civic or whatever, in reality, or national, all nationalisms are ethnic and cultural, simply because all nation states are backed by thick culture of ethos, such as language, territory, patrimony, culture, national holidays, and etc. So all nationalisms, be it American nationalism, be it Azerbaijani and Armenian, what puts them together is that all of them have thick culture, right? And it is this thick culture that has cultural and ethnic connotations. When it comes to acultural citizenship, which is a term, the concept by Brubaker, Brubaker gives a disclaimer that this acultural citizenship virtually exists nowhere in the world because there is no political community in the world that is not backed by the culture of ethos. So that is how he kind of Brubaker breaks down the civic and ethnic form and brings new concepts, letting us to be able to understand it better. These so to make it a long story short, the state-of-art literature questions this conceptualization and regards it as two sides of the same coin, to answer to your question. These terms are politicized. Like they are politicized by the political entrepreneurs. They name their nationalism civic to legitimize their action, to legitimize their assimilation or homogenization tendencies. But in reality, all the nation states have thick culture, which is ethnically and culturally based. That is all I can say.
Yes, Phil, you want to go ahead with the same question?
Yeah, I think I want to add a bit. In principle, fully agreeing with Mirkamran. Qualitatively, I don't see a difference much between civic and ethnic nationalism. It's more of a political, right, or rhetorical difference because, as Mirkamran said, fully agree that nationalism in principle is homogenizing some kind of cultural assimilation. Now, cultural assimilation again can take very different forms from one place or another, right? The way I was mentioning before, because again, you can have it based on kind of the ethos of an ethnos, as is the case actually in Europe and Caucasus, for example, or be based on values, as is the case in, let's say, the US, where essentially the dominant group is not necessarily, well, not indigenous, right? So such as settlers from Europe in case of the American continents. So essentially for them, having this indigenous ethos wouldn't make sense. So they are bringing, because then they would be in the losing end. So they are building it on cultural, other type of cultural ethos, in this case, values, right? So we have shared values. And but then it still goes on becoming extremely cultural, because it will be like quite absurd in a way, say that the US is not based on cultural homogeneity. The whole world is dominated by American culture, essentially, if you think. So obviously that has been, first of all, also created, let's say, within America itself. Then it was able to export from that everything from food to music to other forms of art and history, of course, and everything. So again, in principle, I fully agree that it's like all the nationalisms are in principle cultural. And then therefore, are very similar to each other, each, of course, picking different claim of legitimacy. Where I see, why do we have this notion, in addition to Orientalism, which I fully agree as well, but why this Orientalism emerged and why is the claim of civic nationalism as better, in my view, exists, is this paradox that Western states are trying to reconcile of claiming essentially inclusivity, right? So the inclusivity, different overall of their states, and true democracy, democracy and inclusivity are very major parts of their ethos, while they're at the same time ethnic entities, right? So politically, so trying to reconcile these two creates this need in a way to create it. So, and the ethnic nationalism is fully exclusivist, right? So trying to reconcile this fully exclusivist concept of a nation state with rhetorical claim of inclusivity is where I believe the need to come up with the myth of civic nationalism comes. And why it's extremely problematic, even on a very practical level. Again, maybe it's a bit easier to justify the claim of civic nationalism in the newer states, newer continents, from European perspective, of Americans and Australia. But it's very hard to justify at all in Europe, where it is very much heavily based on claims of historicity and being indigenous. So French nationalism is extremely ethnic nationalism. Actually, it's probably you can put in a core of definition of ethnic nationalism, and yet, right, it pushes its civic concept. And also in terms of violence, supposedly civic nationalism was supposed to be less violent, ethnic more, and by all means, ethnic nationalism is violent. But so is civic nationalism, right? So like look into have our European states, including during after they became democracies in late 19th century or throughout 19th century, been less violent. They've been by far the most violent states, both in terms of the worldwide colonization and innumerable massacres, to, of course, enslavement of people centuries after it seemed to be gone, to genocides of their own populations, right? So obvious example being Holocaust, but not limited to that. So any minority population. So there's been extreme violence in what effectively we're claiming to be civic states. And if you even go further and look into the kind of other forms of identity that are not ethnic, such as communism, right? So are other forms of organization and nationalism, because Soviet Union was still nation state, right, at some point, but based on well, it had national identities, but it wasn't the basis for holding the community together, right? It was ideology. Then you also have a very massive violence against anybody who doesn't fit, essentially, or doesn't conform. So essentially, there has been empirically no evidence, in my view, of civic nationalism being less violent, or civic forms of creating national community being less violent than ethnic one, while ethnic is certainly violent as well. So that's where I just don't see the claim of superiority as having any validity. But I do see some functional differences. Again, one, the civic one, yes, we're obviously trying to focus more on citizenship and kind of value-based, let's say, assimilation, right? So you all need to be pro-democracy, you all need to be for freedom and individual rights, essentially accept, liberal, neoliberal form of governance, and that's the values within which we agree. While the other one is much more heavily based on kind of a particular group with claims to antiquity.
Thank you. What I hear from both of you is the criticism of nationalism, and both of you try to argue and establish that this is a socially constructed concept. But then my question is, why it's so challenging, why it's so difficult actually to challenge its hegemony in our region? And particularly if we look at the period after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it seems like our region is fluctuating between nationalism and authoritarianism, as if no other imagined community or no other alternatives are possible for us. So if as you argue, and I agree with you, it's a social constructed concept, in many cases a very destructive concept, why do you think we are trapped still in this ideology? And I think it's raising all over the world in the recent days. So why it's so challenging, so difficult to challenge it? Maybe Mirkamran first, and then Phil, and this will be our concluding questions. And I open the audience to type their questions or open their mics and just jump into the conversation.
Yeah, it's really an intriguing one. This, of course, doesn't have an answer that can all fit for all. And that's why I will have to contextualize why it has been challenging, especially in the case of Armenia and Azerbaijan, because there are different kinds of nationalist conflicts that we can't have an answer to all. But in this particular case, it has been difficult for so many reasons. First reason I would say is all-encompassing one. As Soviet Union was seen as the prison of nationalities by those of the national entrepreneurs, the collapse of Soviet state in 90s was naturally accompanied by policy of nationalizing nationalism by all the ex-Soviet republics. Literally 15 of the ex-Soviet republics had a policy starting from 90s called nationalizing nationalism. What is this concept? This is a concept, again, devised by Brubaker. This concept aims to construe nationalizing tendencies of many many incipient ex-Soviet republics. What are the tendencies? These tendencies, nationalizing tendencies, would include new language policies, new national legislations, nationalization of school curricula, rise of ethno-national appeal in the political discourse. So these were the all-encompassing reasons for almost all of the ex-Soviet republics why ethno-nationalism became as the central discourse in all of the like more or less Soviet post-Soviet politics. The second reason lies in particular with Armenian-Azerbaijani cases. As I mentioned earlier, it is usually ethnic conflicts which crystallize ethno-nationalism. If not for an ethnic conflict, ethno-nationalism, of course, it can still crystallize, but it has much easier chances to get crystallized if there is a conflict, and it has easier chances to the salience of this ethno-national sensitivity to increase. And this indeed happened in Armenian-Azerbaijani experience. We saw the first Karabakh War, then there was 30 years of interwar period, and we saw the second Karabakh War, and over the past 4 years, we have had the clashes, and all of these had a lasting impact on Armenian-Azerbaijani societies, and it probably will continue to shape the political discourse and political thinking in both societies for some time. Third reason lies with the past memories. Given that it's not for the first time in Armenian-Azerbaijani societies had a bloody conflict, the past memories make the ground even more fertile for the trauma of the conflict to resist any form of healing, right? So the past memories of the 1905 clashes, 1918 clashes already had been there, which paved the way or made it easier for the clashes in 90s to take shape. And last reason lies with the culture of politics in South Caucasus in general. Given almost all political crises in Armenia, Azerbaijan are related to territorial integrity, nationalism, right to self-determination. It was also, the nationalism was also instrumentally beneficial for the politicians, or if not for beneficial, it was easy for politicians to exploit the already existing narrative instead of making a labor and remaking new discourse from nowhere, from nothing. They just easily use the existing narratives and discourses to simply come to power and then to continue to be in power. So these are the reasons why, more or less, if I have to brief the reasons why challenge, it's been difficult, really to challenge the hegemony of ethno-nationalism in this particular context.
Philip? Yeah.
Again, in principle, agree in almost everything that Mirkamran said. And going to your original question, yes, of course, I think it's a social construct, but social construct doesn't make it any less real in a particular time and space, right? So it's not like somebody woke up that morning and built something, which again sometimes happens, and that's why you have many states that don't necessarily hold together. Like the whole fragile state, failed state idea is that exactly they don't necessarily have the ingredients that tend to keep nations together. In Armenian-Azerbaijani case, we do have ingredients that hold it together, and the war is a major one. So I fully agree with Mirkamran on this one. So there is another, since we get there already, let me also put some more theories. So there's other theories of nationalism, Charles Tilly and Mohammed Ayub being probably the biggest names who discuss it, that see state building as state building and war making essentially as fully interrelated, and strong states, those who hold together, essentially came to be through war. The wars we always had, of course, so throughout history there were different types of wars. But especially Europe again has been very heavily and continually in wars, and not an accident. I think that nationalism emerged in Europe or through European settlers in the US, or in the Americas, where at some point, right, when the idea came up for different reasons, for cultural reasons, the idea of nationalism came up. And then we discussed already the Anderson's argument that it was print press and culture possibility to create some kind of a homogeneity, cultural one. But simultaneously, that started proving to be superior in terms of war making as well. Right? So suddenly these communities that were feeling more bonded together, they were more willing to die for each other, to contribute to that unity. So that started proving superior to the other form, which was essentially empires and kingdoms, right? And loyalty to the sovereign. So that essentially, that loyalty was continually proven weaker than, right? So willingness of people to die for some kind of common nation, right? So then those who nationalized early, let's say, started simply dominating militarily. Then others started quickly catching up. So this is the other version where you have, again, one, you have cultural homogenization through print press and mass education. Two, again, those states that adopt this model early create better unity, more willingness for people to be taxed, right? And contribute their lives. They start winning wars, and then others catch up because to this model, or they go down essentially and disappear, right? Such as a lot of empires collapse, and then others slowly catch up with this model. So that's where you see, for example, yes, weaker states tend to be those who didn't come to be through war. Yes, the Ukraine, there's big divisions within Ukraine until Russia attacks in 2022. Suddenly you see, was everybody acting as one person, right? What happened? War happened, right? So war brought them together. So you did have already the whole cultural production. It wasn't enough necessarily to bring together East, West, and Middle Ukraine. The war did. So Armenia, Azerbaijan had the dubious benefit of essentially becoming nations through war pretty quick. So that's already also in place. So essentially you have this mix of things. But the war one, and I fully agree on Mirkamran with this one, and then war itself, then self-sustaining, right? So then you remove the war, essentially you weaken the national ties, right? So that's like the strange then connection between continually being in war and persevering as national community. So that's one, like looking in the US, there is an argument, for example, again, to give different example, that US being not in war as much as in the past, in the last few years, creates internal divisions, right? So once there is an external enemy, like they were fighting Soviet Union or terrorism, there was more internal unity, right? So essentially the differential by this approach is the absence of war or the big enemy. So that's one. But now bringing it quickly back to the question of, again, social construct, yes. But again, social construct is very strong. So that is the dominant form of political organization right now, right? So essentially you don't look for non-national or non-ethnic version of political organization because it just simply doesn't exist, or if it exists, it's extremely weak, right? So those who try to create non-national ones continually collapse or lose to the ones who are held up like that. So essentially there is the only acceptable, the dominant form that we are trying to conform to, right? So you have all of these tendencies that support essentially reinvesting and continually investing in war and in nationalism, and there's no solution. How to come out of this conundrum if we don't want a war in the longer term? So from my perspective, at least, that's where I stopped seeing conflict resolution as a possibility, because again, all the structures are supportive of the war, right? So to sustain the community, you need war, right? So to create better cultural unity, you need continual war, which is very much based on what, if you think, current Azerbaijani government acts very explicitly, essentially, and for decades the Armenian one. So it's simply out of means to continue war. That's why, yeah, suddenly turned against war. Same Pashinyan government, when they thought they have a possibility of continue the war, they were investing fully into long-term war, right? So simply they're out of means. So that's why I don't see solution as possible, because again, any solution effectively removes the basis of national unity. So that I'm seeing then conflict management, where you just manage the violence and try to minimize the violence. Yes, ceasefires or some kind of disincentives for fighting in the short term, and transformation of not the conflict itself, but primarily of the identities in a much longer term, right? So what does the Armenian identity means? Because as long as Azerbaijani identity means, as long as it's defined by opposition and hatred of the other, which is currently the case, you're gonna have to be continually in conflict effectively, because the basis of your national unity is the hatred of the other, right? So, and then there is enough done violence to each other to continue feeding that narrative. So it should completely redefine what being Armenian or Azerbaijani means, to be able to potentially come out of this conflict. And then there are tricky versions, right? So then do you redefine it against somebody third? Like, are we now all decolonizing from Russia, or are we all fighting, I don't know, Persian Empire, the Ottoman Empire revival, right? So that are we turning from this enemy to that enemy? Also tricky, right? Because then you have Georgia going that route, and then you suddenly have a bigger enemy to fight. That's a different danger there involved as well. Right? Or you base it on something like cultural, like as in some kind of a unity of ideas. It's a tricky one again. You have it's a lot of different type of resources you need, again, such as the experiment we have in the Americas. So it's very hard. So social construct does not equal you wake up in the morning and reconstruct, right? So it's been a lot of decades at least of building up to this point.
Yeah, thank you, Boz. I think this is an endless topic. We can continue it infinitely, but unfortunately our time is limited, and we already have at least 2 questions, which I would like to address to you both. First is about the alternatives to statism or nationalism. And the author is asking whether democratic confederalism, like in Rojava, northern Syria, can be an alternative. It doesn't. It's to both of you basically. Whoever wants to answer first.
Phil, you can go first.
Sure, I'll go first. I think I appreciate the question from maybe different angle, not because of the answer contained in it, but because of the attempt to think of other forms of political organization. I think yes, we absolutely need to think, because otherwise we continue reproducing, right, this model that has been extremely violent and exclusionary, both towards all local minorities and across the borders for the designated enemy. So in that sense, this is not sustainable, and it will collapse with time. The model, the question is how it will collapse, and the current form of collapse of, I think, nation state is going through more atomization, so it's smaller groups. So it's starting to look somewhat more like 19th century in the sense of kind of small groups who have political and economic power dominating. Actually, if anything, Syria is a problematic example exactly of that form of nationalism, right? When a minority holds military and economic power, and through alliances with superpowers effectively oppresses multiple other groups, including majorities of people. So if anything, Syria itself is a very problematic example of building a nation in that direction, which is, I think, where a lot of us are now going, right? So Trump phenomenon in the US, right, is a type of essentially minority nationalism, essentially. So we're going coalescing around white nationalism to continue the domination by that group, right? So in that sense, confederacy, I think, in this world, essentially, where the ethno-national groups dominate, including in nations such as US, where there is a claim of civic nationalism, right? It's still very much heavily, the dominant group is a clear minority, right, of white rich men, essentially. You then have a problem of still fighting this battle internally. That's where I see whether it's called democratic or not, right? But confederation creates, again, goes back to which cultural group gonna dominate economically and politically and militarily, potentially. But I think thinking about, so I don't see that as a solution, because that's Lebanon, that's an attempt in Bosnia, right? So it's all these confederacies tend to become extremely then problematic and violent in the long term, and quite unlivable, frankly. In the current system, again, where the expectation is that the state is run essentially by one center, and the center then tends to be linked with one or another ethno-nationalist group, right? So within that system, I see it very difficult, because you're then going to have a fight over who is dominating. Ethiopia is another example. You have one or another group continually right now, probably going to fall apart as a country, because they have no external enemy as such. They have, but not big enough in a way to coalesce against that. And then you have 4 or 5 groups continually fighting for that dominance, who is going to be the Ethiopian, right? And you can go around the world and see that problem you are mentioning. So it's not necessarily solving anything. But I think thinking about what's that alternative form of organization is extremely necessary, because we do need to find a way out in the long term, or the way gonna come very violently through, again, fracturing and even larger amount of wars that we are currently witnessing.
Thank you, Phil. Well, yeah, it's a really tricky one because number one, I have never anthropologically studied those groups, so I don't know the certain bonds that keep them together. But at the same time, to what extent these bonds, like these communities of alternatives, like to what extent they are or they will have long-term existence as long as the nation states themselves or religious sectarian communities of the medieval period, because these communities were longer, they existed for a longer period. And what makes these communities also more crystallized and cemented than any other alternative is the thick culture, as I mentioned earlier. I am maybe the most pessimistic amongst all of us here, because I really can't envision any political community without any thick culture. In a thick culture that would keep the emotionally these individuals, these people, to connected to that political community. For instance, there have been different authors across the past 300-400 years, all the way from Immanuel Kant, who for the first time tried to find universal human community, and it was continued by Jürgen Habermas, John Rawls, Charles Taylor, all of whom tried to find a universal identity of world federation, where there could be a world community based on certain ideas rather than a specific culture as such. But these are simply political, theoretical discussions, and it hasn't had any any possibility to see the certain versions in the real cases. So yeah, I'm really pessimistic to answer this question, and I really don't have any ability to envision whether what kind of future we can expect from ourselves, from these nation states, because nation states, they themselves are also they are not for eternity. They will be, of course, at some point replaced by some other community, the same way, for instance, religious sectarian communities were replaced by the national communities. And what national communities are going to be replaced by, it is a contingency of a history that is, most of the things are unknown by us because of the our limitations.
Okay, I have one more question, but I think this the author is addressing two different questions, so I'll separate these questions. First is how religion is intertwined between Armenian-Azerbaijani relations. This is the first question. And second question is how Armenian and Azerbaijani nationalisms are comparable to the national liberation struggles of the 60s and 70s. So two different questions. Maybe Phil, we'll start with you. And
Sure,
we have
very different. Sorry.
We have around 10 minutes.
Okay, so short.
And I see another question. So please keep your answers brief.
First one is easy, so I'll try to do it under a minute. So I don't think these conflicts were religious as such, but religion is functionally, let's say, used by both sides when needed. For example, when there is a war, appealing to respective religious communities, right? So you saw Armenians making a lot of calls to Christian world, let's say, to save them from Muslims, and then it's a lot of support from different states with Muslim majorities in support of Azerbaijan. So you do have this kind of a functional use of religion, and of course religion is also part of the national identity, right? So it's not maybe as dominant part as in many other places, but it is. So it doesn't help that these two are of different religion, but it also doesn't necessarily, it's not defining factor either. Russia and Georgia are both Orthodox Christians. It didn't hurt them from save them from going to war, right? So it's in this quite a secular overall environment in that space. I don't think that's a defining part. It's a small part of national identity, plus again used rhetorically when needed.
Yeah, I totally agree with Phil as well, because religion has been only instrumental to shape the image of the country in the international media, and it hasn't had a major role because these are simply national conflicts. In terms of the second question, I'm really confused about what the attendee means by liberation struggle of 60s and 70s. If it is about post-colonial movements, I don't see any relevance I mean, I see a relevance in the sense that all of these nation states, be it Armenia or Azerbaijani, and all the post-Soviet versions, they see themselves post-colonial nation states, which are the case for the national liberation struggles of 60s and 70s. So that can be a way to connect them. But ideally, they are not necessarily connected in a way that this was simply a contingency of history. Soviet Union collapsed, and these nation states emerged, right? And so that's how I would see, like, but I don't know what the question is like meant to ask from us, that how would they want us to connect these liberation struggles to the 90s? But that's the only way to connect them is the post-colonialism, the post-colonial claim of these nation states. That's it.
Thank you. I will move to the new question. If Phil, you don't have anything, yeah, okay. So the second question, I think, is very intriguing for me, at least. If you were at the head of a state or a group of people with unlimited powers to act as peacemakers, what would be the first three actions towards creating a stable peace between nations? Described from both the Armenian and Azerbaijani points of view. So, Phil, maybe you touch Armenian point of view, obviously.
I'll touch a bit on both, though. So first of all, I don't agree with the premise that heads of states have unlimited power. So again, going a bit back to the theory we were discussing, right? So why we have so many populist leaders now, right? So because you need the heads of states, one way or another, are still accountable to keep legitimacy. Even if it's an authoritarian state, you still need to, in some form, preserve that power, right? So you need a consent. So you need to play the game that's already established, and it's a lot of times established through the cultural norms, through political norms. It's very hard to now come to be head of Azerbaijani government, or we are seeing right now in Armenian government, and suddenly try to change the rules of the game. Then you do have protests against you. You potentially are displaced as a head of state. So with that in mind, I do with a very limited power that a head of state can have, especially in a matter concerning conflict. What's possible. So I'll go back to a couple of things I said earlier. Conflict management. I think managing this conflict is very much possible at this point. Horribly the way it's gone until now, it's been full, kind of Armenian military victory, complete exclusion of Azerbaijanis from the territories that Armenia was controlling, Armenian side was controlling. Then Azerbaijan takes over, full ethnic cleansing of Armenians now. So it's been going really bad. And yet, I think at this point, we are in a place where it's not clear what the war is about, other than we want the war because of this identity struggle. So in principle, it should be possible to functionally, right, stop violence and be able to demarcate the innate. Not full peace agreement. I don't see much of a value or possibility in that. I think it might actually create a problem of implementation, but kind of really signing a non-aggression act and essentially working through whatever is remaining there through hard negotiations, which they are doing, by the way, at least to an extent right now. And the second is then focusing on your identity, because it's again, there was one thing when we had Karabakh conflict, and that was very dominant in both. It's not there, they want it or not. So even if they want to, it's very hard to sustain your now identity against Armenians if you're Azerbaijani, or vice versa, because it's possible, but much harder. Right? You don't have an active conflict in the same way. So one way or another, the redefinition of identity will be happening. So thinking of how to change it so it doesn't recreate the conflict, that's two. And three, it's a trickier one, but a necessary one, I think, in some form of reinvestment into democratization project. I wouldn't connect it directly with the solution of the conflict. I think it by all means can be solved. It is being solved through authoritarian means. But it's just not good for your own populations. It's just not like, longer term. It's not it's pretty bad place to live if you continue going with the autocratic route. Of course, we see it in Azerbaijan, but in Armenia, you also see backsliding. So it's just like, yeah, if I were the head of state, I would try to make the life livable.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. You more or less covered what I was going to say, but I would actually focus more on, because also part of my research, more on the long term, how I would, if I were a leader, I would, like what actions would be to create stable peace. I would start with myself as a political leader. I would start changing my own discourse, right? And in parallel, I would start working on the school curricula and media discourse, the memory politics. I would focus more on the identity healing and identity transformation. These would be the main focus, the main foci for me, because I do see that these conflicts are not going to be resolved by the stroke of a pen, signing of a peace agreement, or certain demarcation or delimitation between the two borders. So the long-term solution lies with the identity healing, and that's what I would focus more on.
Thank you. And I'll address you the final question, and it's about the proxy wars between US, EU, Russia, Middle East, and how these proxy wars fuel the nationalist discourses in Global South, and particularly Armenia and Azerbaijan. Who starts? Phil?
Gamaghelyan, welcome.
Mirkamran?
I'm still thinking.
Okay, I'll go. So in principle, yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think overall I don't see much agency in that sense in the big picture in this region, because it's a very small state. So then that's where, connecting to that previous question of national liberation struggle. No, I think we came to be not because of national liberation struggle, but because Soviet Union fell apart. So we are much more similar in that sense to a lot of the post-World War II, post-colonial states, in a sense where the empire fell apart, so you just found yourself independent one day. Yes, you had some movements, of course, and but I don't think that was defining. So we are always essentially being small states in a reactive mode to bigger developments. So by all means, yes, the proxy wars, all the developments in the region, we have to react to them. Same as in our national identities are absolutely reactionary in that sense, right? So Europe started developing in this direction towards, nationalization and ethnic states, and then we basically replicated, right? So the same model. So there is nothing indigenous about our identities or states. We are pretty much playing the bigger game and trying to conform. So from that perspective, though, where do I see a potential necessity for a solution? The tendency now is back to great powers directly or indirectly colonizing the space. So, right, so then we see Russia invading one of the biggest, second biggest, but probably the most powerful second country of former post-Soviet Union, Ukraine. So we are a fair game at this point. So let's accept that. And the independence of Caucasus states is a very, usually has been very short periods where it was able to sustain themselves, in the last at least few hundred years, right? So this is an outlier, is not a norm. And again, if you look back into history, we were conquered all by, one or two going down, and then the rest, maybe 5-10 years later going down, maybe immediately. So in that sense, right, so nobody, I think, in that space can survive for a long term without solving our own conflicts and maybe going towards some form of not a confederation. I don't believe in joint governance, but at least some form of a union, a loose union, that at least with a non-aggression pact, that you can somehow protect yourself, right, from being taken over, or be big enough actor to withstand the bigger pressure. So I see the cooperation between Armenia and Azerbaijan as simply a necessity, because yet, in absence of geopolitical rivalries in 90s, we were the main enemies with each other. At this point, even the other is too small of a adversary. We have much bigger problems essentially moving forward. So we better recognize that soon.
Yeah. I agree what you said, Phil, but I mean, in Armenian Azerbaijani context, maybe not, but maybe partially related. But for instance, in the past couple of months, we see, there is already the dynamics of the geopolitics are especially the geopolitical rivalry over Caucasus region between the collective West, as if like EU being the primary player and the Russia on the other side. And this has already created certain dissent from the Azerbaijan, especially the role of France and how Azerbaijani government started, complaining about France meddling with the affairs of the Caucasus. And recently, I was following the news and how Azerbaijan has invested itself in the New Caledonia and with the post-colonial, instrumentally using the post-colonial claim and in order to simply have the agency of the post-colonial country, and Azerbaijan being the supporter of this. So there have been certain roles. Of course, this is not a necessarily proxy war, but this rivalry, especially in the past couple of years, has been intense, and it has of course affected the political discourse of the especially in the case of Azerbaijan. It is completely noticeable how political discourse is shifting from post-colonial then to the other, instrumentally using this. This is what I see, that this geopolitical rivalry has it affects the nationalist discourse on the one side, being the nation state, and on the other side, siding with the post-colonial liberty movements of somewhere in the edge of the world for the instrumental reasons. So yeah, this is what I see that is affecting the nationalist discourse in the country, in these countries.
Okay, thank you both. We're right on the time. Thank you for a very interesting conversation today. I also thank our audience for attending. Yeah, this is the end of our webinar today. And next week on 24th, we have a webinar with Zaur Sharif and Shujat Ahmadzadeh for Azerbaijani-speaking audience. So those of you who speak Azerbaijani, join us to discuss the geopolitics, changing geopolitics in our region. And yes, thanks a lot. See you at our next webinars.